Partha, thanks for coming on. Very first question that we want to throw out to you to lay down the groundwork is, what's your expertise? What do you see yourself as a leader in, and what are you an expert in the cybersecurity industry?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I was fortunate to work in multiple areas and domains in cybersecurity throughout my career. And even beyond cybersecurity, I worked in infrastructure, network, systems administration, development. But when it comes to cybersecurity, if I have to say something where my expertise, I would say like why most of the places hire me. And in most of the places where I went, I was given a cybersecurity program which was mostly reactive, not very structured, spending a lot of money, but not able to get a handle on risk. And I was asked to build a strategic security architecture or engineering function. So last 5 or 6 jobs that I have been doing, so I spent most of my time in building a strategic architecture function and also taking the organization to digital transformation like the cloud journey and all. And again, cloud journey can never be successful if you don't think ahead of the time, because once you're in the game and if you don't plan accordingly, it may not go very well. So in summary, I would say like security architecture and building architectural maturity towards a target straight strategic vision is my expertise.
And that's not easy. Just give us an understanding of what size organizations you've helped.
Yes. So I'm 100% aligned with you. That's definitely not easy, because architecture is different thing in different people's mind. Some people relate architecture with some of the frameworks that you have, enterprise architecture, best practices, but not all of those 100% fit into the realm of cybersecurity. So when you talk to architecture, I have walked through the door and I was in the middle of a firefight, day one. Like people are troubleshooting an incident. And as the leader, I thought that it is an opportunity for me to also join and learn and see how things goes. And what I found in many organizations in day one when I joined, having a PowerPoint diagram sometimes is considered to be architecture. Sometimes calling someone who knows how the system was designed is something to be architecture. And in some time, the information scattered across emails or 20,000 Word documents is also architecture. So people relate architecture with a bunch of information, can be a structured, semi-structured, or completely unstructured, but nothing beyond that. What is the ecosystem? How things fit together? How it is future-looking? More importantly, how it is business aligned? How it is solving the business problem? Those are the parts not easy to understand and relate. And that is why, like, building an architecture and getting the buy-in is not always easy. And most of the organizations, what I found, it is definitely very difficult first few months. But to answer your second question, like what are the size of the organizations I help? I was fortunate enough to walk up and down the spectrum. I worked in the companies like Bank of America or JP Morgan, where it was like 300,000 plus employees, 100,000 plus IT employees, $1 billion plus cybersecurity budget. 2, I worked for companies like Guardian Life Insurance, where less than 10,000 employees, or even much smaller security budget. So I worked like Fortune 15 to Fortune 500 and even beyond organizations in my last 20 plus years.
In organizations of those size, architecture is going to probably mean slightly different things in those organizations. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, absolutely. In some organizations, when it is a larger organization, architecture means like, number one, a larger team and more structured documentation. And in some cases, the documentations, to be very honest, are like putting you in an ivory tower, right? You come up with great visual diagrams, PDFs, and PowerPoints, which is too good to be true, like a real world scenario. And then you hand it over to your engineering partners, your operation partners, and they say that this is kind of not a great use to me because it is not related to the ground reality. You are asking me to build something where I don't have the foundational maturity in my organization. So in larger organizations, architecture had a lot of structured documentation, SharePoint, or like a Confluence website. In smaller organizations, not so structured, The information was there in some shape and form, but did not have that much of a method or even process or procedure, metrics, and reporting. So it varies depending on the organization size. But one thing that is common that I have seen in larger organizations or even smaller organizations is, in order to have a checkbox, do you have a security architecture function? Yes, most of the companies have it. Even if they don't have it, right now they're building it. But if you ask them, how effective is your security architecture function? Can you tell me, if you take me to production, can you tell me one of your current implementation is exactly following the guidelines given by your architecture? How you prove the efficacy and the effectiveness of the dollars spent in the architecture function? Every companies I have seen struggled, right? So I do have a function, but I cannot basically tell how much of that is properly utilized and how much value I'm getting out of it, or how much I am out of compliance from what architecture tells me to do.
How do you measure that value?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So most of the time I spent in the organization in building those KPIs and KRIs, which basically tells whether the architecture function is worth continuing to invest or not, right? So number one is that if you have a well-rounded architecture practice and your architecture documentations are built taking the input from your engineering and operations partners, if you incorporate their pain points, not only the strategic vision 20 years down the line, how the company should look like, you also have to assess what are the pain points of your partners are having, what your business is looking at. I mean, is business, like for example, a healthcare company, there are a lot of the functions being done by AI right now. There's a huge push, be it a drug discovery to patient experience to like many other things are being AI enabled in the healthcare industry and many other industries. Now, if the business wants to go in AI and the Gen AI route, what are the security constraints you need to have? You need to think and look at ahead of the time and build it in your architectural design pattern and the recommendations, right? So in order to measure efficacy, one of the measure is that how quickly your innovation projects can see the lights of production. Previously, right? Think about it. If you don't have a structured architecture and you are coming up with a, say, financial services solution where it is measuring the pulse of the customer. Now, what happens in every company? Security is a big stakeholder right now. Before you go and see the lights of production, you need to get a security sign off. And in many cases, risk acceptance is also part of it. Now, if you are not following the proper security guideline and the architecture, the security sign off is going to take some time because you will have a lot of the out of compliance things. You will have to either do a risk acceptance or you will have to, build some of the security requirements at the last moment. As a result, your time to see the lights of production will get extended because you did not partner earlier with security. You did not follow the architectural guidelines. As a result, you have to do it many things at the last moment reactively. So one of the parameter which I say, which is business impacting, as a business partner, my CIO partners can see before you had a good architecture practice and process and in place, for me to get any new innovative idea in production or cloud, it used to take like 60 days or 90 days. Now, following that practice, the time comes down to 7 or 15 days or something like that. So this is a parameter. Now, one snapshot may not tell whether it's a great practice or not, but if you start measuring it over the period of like 3 to 6 months, you will see a trend line going down. That means as you are maturing your architecture practice, as you are socializing it better, as you are partnering with your CIO and infrastructure teams better, the adoption becomes much more quicker. So this is one parameter. The second parameter is that if you follow the right architectural guidelines, the drifts you find in production, like the systems which does the security posture management and drift detection, you start measuring how many drifts you see prior to having a right architectural function. And second thing, when you have an effective and efficient architectural function embedded in your SDLC lifecycle, you should see the operational drift, the configuration drift gradually should go down because you are following the patterns. You are following the security as a code practices which are given. So it will minimize the drift. As a result, the number of incidents which used to come out of those drifts or out of compliance configuration, even Amazon had one of the largest breach because of a configuration drift, which was a human error. right? So those things eventually will go down. So your time to market is a parameter you start measuring. If architecture is good, then time to market will be lower. Then your configuration drifts gradually will go down. As a result, security incidents will definitely show a downward trend. The number of risk acceptances that you have to do for any new application without a good architectural practice, you may have a lot of higher risk appetite and risk acceptance process. The number of risk acceptance will go down. So these are some of the metrics. So like that, there are like 8 to 10 solid metrics that any organization can measure to see how much value security architecture is adding to the overall business.
Yeah, and one that you kind of mentioned, the configuration operational drift, do you have something solidified for a measurement of that? That can take many different shapes and forms. So the question I have in my head is, a lot of our listeners might be like, yeah, we have drift, but like I don't really have a way of measuring it other than the seat of my pants of saying this is an incident or this occurrence happened and I can classify it as a drift. But like, is there things I could do to be better at identifying those and measuring those?
Absolutely. Even in my last few jobs, I have done that thing using the security blueprints. So, and again, when we talk about architecture, as I said, architecture has a different meaning to different people. For some people, a Word file is architecture. But what I try to do in every single organization I go, I define the architecture ecosystem. And what are the inputs of that ecosystem and what are the outputs? And those outputs, in which stage of your project lifecycle, which one becomes predominant, which one becomes more applicable, right? So the first thing is that in the architecture, like the products of the architecture function is a security reference architecture, which is a high-level, business-aligned picture of your entire end-to-end thing. For example, if you have a cloud service provider, what is the cloud reference architecture? That will cover your network connectivity, your compute, your logging and monitoring, your identity and access management, your data protection, your application security. It will provide the high-level guardrails and boundaries that when you are connecting to a cloud service provider, these are the 6 or 7 or 10, like, again, depending on your reference architecture and the complexity, the things that you must build and you must implement. Now, reference architecture stays at a high level. It basically talks about you need to have an identity and access management system. It should be, based on the zero trust principles. You should be continuously validating the posture. You should be checking like many other things. But it may not go into more details of bits and bytes, which the engineering team can take more specific instructions to implement, right? Reference architecture is like, basically, when you create your Wiz or Google Map from New Jersey, I traveled to Chicago a few times. Like when I give a source and destination, it shows you the high-level route map, shows that, okay, I'll be traveling over Pennsylvania, Ohio, and all. But without having that high-level route map or reference architecture, you could be diverted. You can go to probably Lake Erie and then come down to maybe Florida and go to Chicago. It will take like probably 20 more days to go from New York to Chicago. So reference architecture in a real life example is this. It basically defines the guardrails and boundaries, draws your path. These are the states and these are the path you are going to take in order to reach from New York to Chicago. So that's the high level reference architecture. When you are moving your application to cloud, you need to have these components of identity. You need to have privilege access management. You need to have, like a 256-bit encryption. You need to have TLS. So the high level roadmap. But now that high level route map, if you just show to your driver and the driver is trying to get out of Manhattan and get into, like an I-80 or I-280 or something, the driver doesn't know because in front of the driver, you just see those, streets and avenues, right? You have to tell the driver, hey, make a right on 6th Avenue, go straight, drive 50 feet, and then make a right. Those are equivalent to the engineering instructions or the engineering scripts, how you build it. Right? So the architecture tells from Manhattan, you go to Pennsylvania, Ohio, you take a break in, Cincinnati or something, and then you go to Chicago. But the engineering script will be as details that go 200 feet, make a right on 3rd Avenue, then take this exit and do this. Blueprint bridges the gap between that high-level route map and turn-by-turn instruction. So the blueprint is the architectural output, which converts those high-level things close to a language that the engineering team does understand, and that can be codified by a developer. That can be implemented in a Palo Alto or a Checkpoint or Cisco firewall or something through some configuration parameters. So in order to coming back to your point, like how do you manage drift? For every domain, be it a remote access connectivity, be it a third-party connectivity, be it your web hosting in cloud, be it something else, right? Create like whatever your business use cases are for your IT, for each of those, you will have a security reference architecture, right? Then convert that reference architecture into a design pattern or blueprint, which is a lower level instruction, which can be given to the engineers and they understand the frequency and they can start implementing those and codifying those things. Now, once you publish those blueprints, what I have done in my last healthcare stint, we created like 80 plus blueprints only in cloud. And all those blueprints were coded in the Palo Alto Prisma system, right? Palo Alto Prisma is basically a drift detection, CSPM, cloud security posture management solution. So we basically loaded those blueprint requirements, which are eventually broken down into piece of code, into Palo Prisma so that it had a checklist of this is what you need to measure and this is what you need to alert if there is a deviation from this. So that's how the drift detection coming purely from reference architecture, converted into blueprint, got into a codified format, then you input it into a CSPM system, and then you have a clear dashboard of reporting of your deviations as engineers are building something.
Listen, if you made it this far, I'm just going to ask you for one favor. Most of you listening right now haven't subscribed. Go ahead, feed that algorithm, and support us by clicking subscribe. Doing so allows me to bring you great content and allows us to bring more exceptional guests onto the podcast. Go ahead, hit subscribe. I appreciate it. Got it. And when you're thinking about this, how much of this is policy driven versus technical controls are actually making individuals and different departments adhere to the architecture and the blueprints that you put forward? Like, what's the difference between policy versus technical enforcement?
Yeah. So that's actually a great question. The first thing comes, right? Even I teach few courses in Northwestern University for the master's program and 3 cybersecurity questions. And I tell all my students all the time that whatever you build, the very first thing for a sustainable architecture or engineering is keeping it simple, not to over-engineer something. Do not build overly complicated controls, which is beyond your business objective or your risk appetite. And also build something which is absolutely relevant. I should not have a dream that let's make the life of the developers complicated tomorrow. So let's come up with some security architecture with 20,000 complicated controls. Surely they're going to bypass it. They're not going to implement that. Yeah. So the first thing we need to do is that work with your governance, risk, and compliance team. Look into your organization's high-level policies and standards. Because if you comply with your policy and standard, then indirectly, depending on the industry, whether it is a FISMA or it is a HIPAA or if it is a high trust boundary or if it is an NYDFS requirement or FRB requirement, you just name it. Any regulation authority or any ISMS framework, you'll be compliant because those requirements were taken into account when the policies and the standards were created by the compliance team. Now, if you have a mature governance, risk, and compliance practice, then that becomes one of the input for your reference architecture or design pattern. You must ensure that you are following to the policies. If policy says you need to have a privileged access control system, your password must rotate in 30 days, or if you need to have a 16-character password that never rotates, you must implement that. Now, that is only one input. In some cases, the governance, risk, and compliance policies and procedures are not very mature. Then it becomes a partnership. You work with your peers in the GRC team and collectively you build something. Hey, I think this should be incorporated as our policy because this is of the regulation and the industry best practice and all those stuff. But taking just the policies and standards is only solving a piece of the puzzle because our friends on the dark side, they don't read our policies and procedures to attack us, right? They basically try to punch us hard wherever they find the weakest link in our system. So Following the policies and procedures ensures that your architectural standards are aligned with regulations, right, or compliance, or your organization's risk appetite. On top of it, you should have a good partnership with your threat intel organization. You need to know what's coming and ongoing, what type of attack patterns are targeting. You need to have a good amount of data from security operations based on last 6 months or 18 months. What type of attack patterns are repeatedly they are seeing? And that should reveal some of the weaknesses in your organization. Like either you're not doing a good risk management, or you are missing probably some basic things. And that is why, like, you are getting hit by those attack patterns on a repeated manner. So take all those inputs, your security policies and standards, your threat intel, your incident response, like the security operations input, and also your industry peers, like what are the best practices, right? What are the feature looking thing you can incorporate? Combining all this, you should come up with your reference architecture or a design pattern that should be easy to understand. And it should be easy to sell, because most of the time, to be very honest, you will get challenged from the engineering team or the development team. Why? Why I need to implement so many controls? Because it is making my life difficult. It's not free. It comes with a tax. And you have to convince why factor in a data-driven, risk-aligned approach. I mean, eventually, we should not be saying something that is not solving a high or medium or critical risk problem in the organization. So once you incorporate those sources of information in your reference architecture or design pattern, then you can convert it to a blueprint and then engineering artifact and deploy it. So does that answer your question? Like, what should be the basis of those architectural artifacts?
Yeah. Well, maybe let's roll it back a little bit and say, when you come into a new organization, or you understand what you need to do, but do you know where you need to spend the most amount of time in building that, right? So is there some things when you come in and you look at, you mentioned seeing what policy is there and what's existing, but a lot of the listeners of this podcast do come from an offensive security background too, right? As security consultants or testers of some fashion. And they know that words on paper are just words on paper, right? So like, is there something that goes beyond that helps you really understand what the risk is at the organization? So that way, when you're building this architecture, you know that in the first 90 days, you're solving like some of the most painful problems, and, versus working on building architecture when over here we have a bunch of criticals that keep repeating because there is no blueprint set forth, right? So how do you know where those gaps are on day one and where you should be focusing?
So the very first thing is that when I take over my new responsibility in a new organization, I look for any existing report, be it audit or pen testing or red team or the big four consulting. I mean, most of the time you will find that, okay, there was a consulting engagement to identify the SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats or something, right? Or a NIST assessment was done and these are the red and yellow areas. So that becomes the first input. Like I at least have something to know, okay, my identity practice is not good. Then, as I said, building the partnership, working with the red team, the pen testing team, the security operations team, right? Because the moment you engage your red team, eventually they find innovative attack patterns to break your system. But there are some basic things they try in every single organization. Okay, are these ports open? Like, is the access there, right? Is the lateral movement becomes easy? I mean, is the exploit available that I can, literally move, use that exploit, and then escalate my privilege and do something. So I talk to them and try to understand, okay, show me like last 6 months or 1 year red team assessment. Like, what are the common themes and patterns that you found? Like, to be very honest, and they appreciate it. It's not that, okay, I'm trying to make their life difficult. They basically come and tell, hey, these are very basic thing, and I'm able to, like, I want to do a better job. I want to think even beyond those basic things and come up with innovative ideas to break. But I'm finding those easier avenues. So I collect those information from them, right? What are the top 10 things you are finding again and again? And I want to make at least block those things and ensure like those are repeatedly in a consistent manner implemented through my architectural design pattern. Same with security operation, the trend data, right? Maybe we find some of the vulnerabilities existing. And then when you deep dive into a root cause analysis, you find that the team that is doing the Terraform implementation when it comes to cloud, they are probably missing something. And they're probably missing something because there was not a clear instruction from an architecture or a blueprint perspective that you must do this, right? So I don't want to go into examples. There are tons of examples where the root cause was fixed in the Terraform template. Eventually, it was driven by the blueprint team. But to answer your question, yes, having the partnership, tapping the knowledge base of the red team assessment team, the threat hunting team, and then the penetration team, and then the security operations, along with the threat intel team, right? And then combining all that information, you will find some patterns are coming out of those data. And those patterns will tell that there are like 8 or 10 basic things which are grossly missing across all of your implementation. When you combine them in your design pattern and blueprint, ensure your engineering scripts are using it. There is also another thing which I started in my last company. How do you ensure what security recommendations you are giving, engineering team is exactly using it or implementing it, right? A lot of the time, what you do is that you are basically telling engineering team is implementing something just because they did not have a proper guideline. Now you have a guideline. You are telling, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Drive 300 feet and make a right turn or make a U-turn. You're giving that instruction. But where is the feedback loop? Where is the monitoring that the engineering team is doing that accordingly? Because if they are not doing it, the net result is all the same. You can build an architecture practice that is in paper. It does not get implemented properly. So for that, I actually started creating an architecture assurance function, right? In my last healthcare job, I built a team. And that team's job where they were, think about it, the second line of defense on top of engineering. So they have the architectural patterns given by them, and they also see the engineering deployment and implementations. There were like multiple things. They used spot checks, they used QC validations, they use script and automation to ensure that the blueprints are properly getting implemented. If not, they will flag it to the engineering team, hey, you are deviating. And again, it is another type of a drift management. Now the drift is from the architecture pattern. Hey, you are deviating from those drifts. So once you have those oversight, the engineering team becomes even more conscious and careful that, hey, I just cannot accept a document from architecture and say you're all good, because there is someone looking over my shoulder and checking whether I'm implementing thing or correctly or not. So building the architecture ecosystem with reference architecture, design pattern, blueprint, taking input from the compliance policy, then the red team and the threat intel and the like all of the security operation and team to incorporate those themes in your architectural artifact, and then handing over to engineering in a frequency that the engineering team can understand. And those instructions are implementable, right? That means you have more specific instructions that the engineering team can implement as opposed to a very high level thing, go from New York to Chicago, right? And then building the function called architectural assurance, who will do the checks and balances on engineering implementation to ensure the architectural guidelines are properly comprehended and implemented by the engineering team.
Yeah, who do you count on to assure that? Do you build a whole separate team, or do you lean on GRC team, external auditors, managers, leaders?
So
everyone?
This architectural assurance function was sort of like to be very honest, it was my brainchild, because I did architecture in many organizations where I could fix the left side of the spectrum and hand over to the right side, but there's a disconnect. I don't know if right hand is properly implementing left hand or not. So I say that let's come up with a validation function. Now, I wanted that validation function to be a very technical team, because eventually they have to understand the Terraform script. They have to understand the architectural thing. So you cannot do a compliance validation thing, right? It is definitely not an IT or security auditor where they come and ask, okay, show me NYDFS requirement 12. Where are you meeting? Give me an artifact, right? It's not like reading a bunch of report. It is architecture says you have to implement a privilege access control where you need to, by turning on X. And engineering team is basically saying, hey, I turned on X. You need to have a technically competent team who can say, yes, they have turned on X. So ideally, I built my architecture assurance function with very senior individuals from the team. Those who work in a cross-functional environment in multiple domains, those who come from operations, those who come from engineering, those who have done a little bit of architecture. So those who have a holistic approach and understanding of how end-to-end things work, and with some expertise. There were people who were experts in firewall. There were people who were actually experts in Terraform scripting. There were people who were experts in identity. So I created a small team, but a strike workforce who had the depth to go into that engineering script to understand the engineering thing, but who also had the breadth. I mean, they worked in network, identity, and many things to understand how end-to-end works. But to answer your question, it was a brand new team reporting to me. Now you can question, okay, where is the independence of it? Because I was running architecture and the validation team was also reporting to me. I thought through it, but again, even after a thoughtful discussion with all of my peers, we thought that it is sort of a QA function within architecture. So that is why it can be aligned to me as the leader of the architecture. But it was having an oversight. They built a lot of actually automation and script. They used a lot of bots to validate those engineering things, correlating multiple data from Prisma and multiple things, and eventually create a very clean dashboard to me where it used to provide me, okay, I had like 80 blueprints published. One of the blueprint was privilege access management, and it will basically tell privilege access management blueprint was validated against 20 engineering implementations in environment 1, 2, 3. And these are like red, yellow, and green. Green are absolutely aligned. Reds are missing. Yellow is borderline. It still depends on interpretation. So that's how we started tuning, right? Wherever we found there was a yellow line, the engineering team was questionably implementing it. We had the conversation, hey, is the instruction not very clear? Or there is an implementation issue? How can we improve our blueprint process as well? So that's how we implemented that.
In that improvement, do you give them the power to put in prevention, right? Because if they're doing this assurance, they're detecting that there's an adherence, right? And if there's enough adherence, and could they build in some prevention so that way that the adherence is forced versus just kind of managed?
That's actually a great idea. We did not force it. I mean, we did not empower the team to make the change on either side. They were actually fact-finding team. And then the fact can be on both sides. Like on the architecture side, maybe the instruction was not clear, right? And the feedback was to them, hey, you asked them to do X. In reality, they can only do this. You have to be more specific exactly about what you want them to implement. Otherwise, they're not getting it. So it's a feedback to architecture to enhance their blueprint and make it more clear. And in some cases, they found the blueprint was absolutely clear. Engineering team missed it. And they will go and basically tell engineering, okay, now you have to update your deployment script. You need to include this because this is missed out. So they were fact-finding, and the recommendation and reporting, bring it to me, bring it to the leadership team on all the sides, and then eventually making an impact. But to your idea, I like that great idea as well. Maybe in my next iteration, right, whatever I do, there's a possibility that, okay, empower them to fix it with some touch point to the right team, because fixing it one time versus making it repeatable means the teams which are creating, they have to be actively involved in it. So we need to come up with something so that it is instantaneously fixed, opposed to having another review, wait for a week or two to fix it.
Yeah. I like the fact that you basically built the feedback loop, to make sure that there is adherence to those blueprints. I think we've all got in Uber or Lyft, right? And, the map says you're going to take this route to get there. And all of a sudden, the driver's like, nah, I know the better route, right? I'm going to go this way, right? And I think that's very comparable here to what we're talking about. Sometimes the difference, though, is, you being the Uber or Lyft, application can track where that car is. So you can see that they took a different path to get to the same output or end result. Whereas I think sometimes it's not that obvious, right? It's kind of like, oh, I'm turning off my GPS right now, so you can't track how I get to that. And that's the harder part. And I like how you put a team in place to basically say, all right, like, let's do the assurance checks for when, maybe things are not clear, or it is clear, but they didn't go that direction that was provided.
Or they turned off the tracking, because if the tracking is off for 30 seconds, I can understand there could be some glitch. But if the tracking is off for 30 minutes, then there is something else going on, right?
So, yeah, right. You have some questions that need answering.
Yeah. So yes, so that assurance function, it took time, to be very honest. And I tell you, like those who are, I'm part of a CISO group with like 200 plus participants, and we do share a lot of ideas there. And before implementing that, I shared this idea with that group. And I said that, hey guys, what do you think? Do you think a similar thing? Everybody gave a thumbs up. He said that, hey, that's a great idea. You implement and then share us how it works or not. So what I shared with them, and I'm sharing if it helps anyone listening to this podcast, it was not easy to sell that idea. The moment I said architecture assurance function, people were getting completely confused. I mean, they started thinking, okay, are you doing a red team, blue team, this? Are you doing a control testing? What are you assuring? Because there are multiple assurance functions in a cybersecurity organization. So, like drawing the picture, explaining them what assurance they were providing it took quite a bit of time. I mean, there were a lot of resistance initially, but after a few iterations, when people started seeing the value and saw the drifts going down, then the acceptance eventually came in.
I could see that. Yeah, the first thing that come to mind is like, okay, if we're actually talking about infrastructure as code, that's structured language. Why are you drifting in the first place, right? To me, it's almost kind of like, did the user story work out, right? Like, did you build the thing that was needed? So I guess I could see that there could be many questions into that. How did you combat that? Did you just come with a lot of examples to showcase, to make sure you have the understanding and everyone kind of could see the example of the problem that you're trying to solve?
Yeah. So there were a lot of peer-to-peer conversation. So I mean, when I came up with this idea of infrastructure assurance, because it is not only just infrastructure as a code, like a Terraform or ARM or anything that we are writing. It is also, there are some cases where you have the tools and technologies which cannot be coded. Like you have to use a GUI and implement it with a central management console. There are some classic security controls also like that, which cannot be like fully automated. So that team was actually validating on both sides. One, that can be implemented through code. If something is missing, then something is missing in the code in the beginning, right? So you have to fix that. In some other cases, like let's give an example of a Zscaler proxies that most of the people were using. They were configuring using a management console, right? It was not a code. Like, so somebody will have an engineering script. Okay, go to that SSL setting, turn on the queuing, do this and do that. So it was even validating that, because that manual script of how to navigate the GUI or turn on a configuration was not doing something right. And as a result, all the architectural blueprints were not properly getting implemented. But coming back to your question, the team was equipped to do on the both side, on a GUI-driven thing and an automation-driven thing as well. But it was a lot of conversation with the peers, especially where they had some sort of an assurance function, because there was an application security team. Application security team was also doing a similar thing in the SaaS, DAST, IAST, and all those stuff. Like, these are the testing we're doing. We are finding bugs and vulnerabilities. We are reporting back somebody's fixing. So having that conversation and telling them what is the scope of their assurance and what is the scope of this architectural assurance. Architecture was overarching. It was touching all the domains. And it was basically telling about how to implement things, what the blueprint is telling to the engineering team. And what they were doing a deeper assurance of some of the products and technologies, or even adherence of the guidelines like provided by those technologies in a particular domain. So there were some, I mean, I will not say that it was completely without any overlap. Initially, we came up with an idea like, okay, we are going to do this 30 things. And when I met with some of my peers, we found that there was an overlap as well. Like, some people were doing part of it in some way. But the problem was the central feedback was missing. It was not taking any action. It was very reactive. They were finding a gap. They're reporting to the, say, implementation team who are doing it. But just to give an example, it was the difference between an incident management and a problem management. So they were doing just an incident management. They were finding it again and again, fixing it again and again. The problem was not going away because the problem was not fixed because the core architecture was not fixed. It was again repeating every time. So that's how I actually showed, hey, what I am doing with that assurance function is sort of a problem management. And what you guys have been doing is an incident management. Now, what we can do is that we can have some like a decentralized structure. We can have this part of the assurance run by the federated teams, but whatever you find, the action of closing that gap and loop should be done by a central team, just to ensure it is consistently implemented everywhere. So that once you find that problem, the problem is removed at the root. Not like an incident management kind of a thing that you find the problem in the next release again and people start fixing it, right? So wherever we found an overlap between this assurance function and individual domain-wise assurance functions, either we had a federated model or we had a central model where that assurance was taken over by this architecture team because it is more aligned to an architecture assurance. So there was some give and take, like push and pull model, like some of the things were given. But at the end, when you normalize the data and see the gaps and overlaps, I found there were a lot of gaps which were not validated that we were intending to validate using that architecture assurance function. And those gaps, we started actually building with that program, how we can close that gap. And eventually when people saw value, it was adopted. So the initial challenge is explaining it, having a data-driven, like a clear map. These are the 30 things we test, out of which maybe 7 things are tested by some other teams. Then having a conversation, do you want to continue testing it or do you want to offload it to this team? It can go both ways. Even if they're testing it, you want to fix it, fix the problem? Yes, you can fix it. But how do you close the feedback loop so that the architecture, that means your fix, goes to the further left, right? So that next time onwards, this thing does not happen. There has to be a coordinated function. But what I basically will say that just because the architecture assurance function was new, I got a lot of support from different teams that, okay, why don't you take over this function? And eventually it becomes under one accountability and it becomes easy to manage. And that's how we did it. So it took time, a lot of iterations. I would say like overall implementing that function in a Fortune 40 organization properly with full RACI model, accountability, ownership, implementation dashboard took like 1.5 years.
Yeah.
So
that's really cool though. That's to bring together a new function and actually have it work and do the thing that you want. That's awesome. That's an accomplishment.
Thank you. So there are a lot of learnings. Still, there are things which can be done better. But yeah, I mean, like some of my peers are also thinking about doing that, looking forward to learn from their experiences and so that we can continuously make it better. Like it's an evolution. It is definitely, the journey hasn't ended.
Yeah. Partha, I'm sure we could talk hours and hours on these topics, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. If someone wanted to get in contact with you and follow the work that you're doing, how can they do so?
So LinkedIn, my full name, Parthasarathi Chakraborty. So I am very active on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is the best way. Like I literally live and breathe on LinkedIn. So just ping me on LinkedIn and I'll connect. And I love those interactions because it's a both way learning. And I'm a passionate technologist and I love to learn from everyone's experience and share whatever I can.
Yeah, I can tell you're a life learner. So Partha, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. And actually, this gave me a platform to share some of the thing which was my brainchild in one of the organizations, like the architectural assurance function. And would love to get more questions and feedback. I mean, after this podcast goes live, if someone has any question or interest, I would love to have a conversation with them. So feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and we'll be looking forward to it. Thank you very much for your time and this opportunity.
Thanks again. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and check out what we do at Sprocket Security. If you're ever in need of a penetration test and you want that hybrid scalable approach, the always testing, always on, not this fake click a button, do a pen test 2 weeks and then do that 5 times a year. No, I mean always on, always testing, latest bleeding edge threat that comes out there, latest exploit, phishing, all the way to, defense evading, covert operations, whatever type of pen test you need. We'll do it as frequently as possible. And we'll also provide a platform for us to interact together. I've devoted the last 5 years of my life to building penetration testing and innovating upon it and changing it so you can actually do security testing, proactive security testing in a much better way. Give it a shot. Check us out, www.sprocketsecurity.com.